Hey everyone, I'm Mary. Now tell me something. Are you stuck on that boss that seems impossible? Or spending hours exploring corners of the map without finding anything new in Cinderia? Take a deep breath. I went through exactly that in my first playthrough, thinking I had mastered the system, only to take a hit that wiped out half my health in the blink of an eye. That's why today I've brought 10 tips that actually change the game. Not the obvious stuff everyone already knows, but tricks I discovered only after dying 10 times in the same area. Pay attention, because from now on, every encounter will be much fairer. Let's get into it. Look, I'll be honest. When I started playing Cinderia, I also used the dash in the most basic way possible, just to get out of the way of attacks. It was only after a while that I realized I was ignoring one of the most powerful mechanics the game offers. What I found is that Cinderia has practically zero animation lock. This means you can dash in the middle of any basic attack or heavy skill, and the game cancels the end of that animation for you. It seems like a small detail, but when it clicks, you realize how much it changes the gameplay. With this cancel, it's possible to maintain a much more consistent DPS than I thought possible. You use a heavy skill, dash before the recovery frames, and you're already chaining the next hit. Corrupted enemies stay under constant pressure, and combat begins to flow in a way that feels much more functional. My recommendation is to practice on smaller enemies first, without rushing. The timing needs to become natural, almost automatic. It's not something you pick up in 5 minutes, but when you do, you'll look back and laugh at how you used to play. At least, that's what happened to me. I'll tell you something I learned the hard way. Ignoring crowd control in the advanced stages is practically signing your own death warrant. I lost runs that were going great because I thought I could brute force situations where 3 or 4 corrupted creatures came from different directions at the same time. You can't. It just doesn't work. In the Kingdom Ruins, enemies start appearing in heavy groups, and things scale quickly. If you don't have at least one stun, slow, knockback, or some lock effect in your build, you'll find yourself cornered with no way out. What works well is prioritizing at least one area of effectability with one of these effects. It doesn't need to have the highest damage, it just needs to give you that breathing room to reposition. What helped me understand this better was to stop thinking of crowd control as a support skill and start treating it as a survival tool just as important as healing. A good AoE stun at the right moment can save an entire run. And Cinderia has plenty of options in this regard, skills that root, push, or slow enemies. It's worth exploring these during skill choices instead of always going for the highest damage numbers. Looking back, the difference between my runs that went far and those that ended mid-biome almost always came down to this. A build with absurd damage but no control rarely made it. When I started balancing the two, things became much more consistent. It's one of those lessons that seems obvious afterward, but no one tells you right at the start. Cinderia has a build system that seems simple at first, but once you understand how status effects interact, it opens up a completely different world. I spent a long time building for raw damage before realizing I was ignoring one of the richest parts of the game. The key here is understanding that certain effects amplify each other when combined. Poison, for example, already does a decent job on its own with damage over time. But when you combine that with Shadow and Dash within the same build, things start to scale in a way that almost feels unfair, especially against bosses. Shadow amplifies the enemy's fragility, and the Dash, with the animation canceling we mentioned earlier, allows you to apply poison much faster and more consistently. Against bosses, this makes a huge difference. Instead of depending on direct damage bursts, you build constant pressure with damage over time, while Shadow erodes the enemy's resistance. I tested this combination in one of my most recent runs, and it was the first time I felt I was truly in control of a boss fight, rather than just reacting to everything. The community is already calling this combination broken, and it's hard to disagree. If you haven't tried Poison plus Shadow plus Dash yet, it's worth testing while it's still tuned this way. Builds like this are often adjusted in future patches, so taking advantage of the window is part of the game. This was probably the hardest mindset shift Cinderia forced me to make. I've always been the type who likes to maintain constant pressure, attacking non-stop and relying on damage to solve any situation. In the early stages, that actually works. But when the real bosses start appearing, this approach dropped me more times than I care to admit. What truly transformed my gameplay was starting to observe the telegraphs, the visual cues that corrupted creatures display before heavy lunges. Every enemy in Cinderia has specific windows of vulnerability, and the game is quite generous in showing when that moment is coming, provided you're paying attention instead of just staring at your own damage numbers. From the moment I started recognizing these signs, the rhythm of the fights changed completely. Instead of attacking frantically, I began to wait for the heavy lunge, dodge at the right time, and go all in during the enemy's recovery. It feels like you're doing less, but the damage you apply in these specific windows is much more efficient than the chip damage you were trying to fit between their attacks. The result was that enemies who previously seemed like infinite health sponges started melting in a way I didn't expect. I didn't change anything in my build. I only changed when I attacked. And sometimes that is exactly what makes the difference between a run that goes the distance and one that ends in frustration. For a long time, I played in the most direct way possible. Enter a room, clear the enemies, and move on. It seemed efficient. It was only after a few runs that I started to realize I was leaving behind an absurd amount of good loot, purely due to a lack of attention to the environment. The map is full of details the game doesn't explain directly. Walls with slightly different textures than their surroundings, paths that look like dead ends but aren't, rooms you only find if you explore the less obvious corners of each biome. When I started paying attention to this, what I found in these places completely changed what I had available for the rest of the run. Rare items, permanent upgrades, and random events that simply don't appear on the main path. What surprised me most was realizing these secrets aren't hard to find when you know what to look for. The game leaves very clear visual clues for those who are watching. A texture that clashes with the surrounding wall, a shadow in a corner that shouldn't be there, a path that ends abruptly but has something different on the floor. Once you calibrate your eyes for it, it's hard not to notice. The difference between exploring well and passing through is massive in long-duration runs. Permanent upgrades found in these secret areas are exactly the kind of cumulative advantage that makes the second half of the game much more manageable. Since I started exploring more carefully, my runs have become consistently longer, and a good part of that comes from items I simply didn't know existed before. There's a trap almost everyone falls into in the first few hours, and I was one of the victims too. The natural instinct is always to go for the upgrade that increases damage because a bigger number looks like progress. In the beginning of the run, with easier enemies, this logic holds up. The problem is that the game eventually collects the debt for this oversight. What I learned in practice is that survival in the early stages is worth much more than extra damage. Improvements that increase health regeneration or debuff resistance seem less exciting at the time of choice, but they are what keep the run alive when the biome starts getting heavier. A poison debuff you can't resist, or a situation where you leave every room at the limit of your health will cost you sooner than you think. The turning point for me was understanding that you accumulate damage naturally throughout the run through drops, skills, and upgrades that appear everywhere. Survival is scarcer and more fragile to build if you ignore it in the early stages. When I started prioritizing regeneration and debuff resistance early on and letting the damage grow organically later, my runs started going much further consistently. It's a simple mindset shift, but it makes all the difference. Cinderia isn't a game you win by being as aggressive as possible from the first second. It's a game you win by still being on your feet when the hard moments arrive, and those moments will arrive. This is one of those tips that seems obvious when someone says it, but in practice, most people ignore it completely, myself included for a long time. When you're in the middle of a room full of corrupted enemies, the automatic thought is to focus on the enemies. The surrounding environment becomes just a background, and that is exactly where you're letting a huge advantage slip by. The devastated landscapes of Cinderia aren't just decoration. There are natural choke points in practically every map. Narrow corridors, ruins with single passages, structures that force enemies to come from only one direction. When you start using these points intentionally, the control you have over enemy groups changes completely. Instead of being surrounded on all sides, you choose where the fight happens. Besides positioning, the environment has traps and interactive elements that the game barely explains. Collapsing structures, surfaces that amplify certain effects, objects you can use to your advantage if you're in the right position at the right time. I discovered most of this by accident, but once I started looking intentionally, it was hard not to see how much the game rewards those who pay attention to the space around them. What I like most about this mechanic is that it doesn't depend on a specific build or upgrade. It's pure positioning and map reading, something anyone can develop regardless of where they are in the run. Some of my best situations in Cinderia came not from a perfect combo or a finished build, but from simply being in the right place and letting the environment do part of the work. I made this mistake more times than I'd like to admit. I'd enter a room with common enemies, see an opportunity to use my heaviest skill, and spend everything there, only to reach the boss right after empty-handed. The result was always the same, a much longer and riskier fight than it needed to be, simply because I didn't save what mattered for the right time. Cinderia has a real energy and cooldown system for abilities, and this completely changes the logic of when to use each thing. You can handle common enemies with basic attacks and minor skills. You don't need your ultimate for that. The moment that truly justifies saving your high-impact techniques is when the boss's posture bar breaks, because that is exactly when the enemy becomes completely vulnerable and your damage explodes in a way that doesn't happen at any other time in the fight. When I started treating my heavy skills as a strategic resource rather than a tool of convenience, the difference in boss fights was immediate. That broken posture window, which I previously used only with basic attacks, became the moment I dumped everything I had saved, and the bosses simply couldn't take it. It's a completely different feeling than when you enter a fight at the limit of your resources. The mindset that helps is thinking of each heavy skill like a bullet in a revolver. You don't use a bullet on a sparrow when there's a bigger target coming. Saving your ultimate for the right moment isn't playing passively, it's playing smart. And in Cinderia, where every run counts and every decision has weight, knowing exactly when to let it all loose makes all the difference between a run that ends early and one that goes to the end. One of the things that confused me most in the first few hours was trying to understand the stat system. I kept taking a little bit of everything, thinking that diversifying was the safest play. Spoiler, it's not. It took me a few runs to realize I was diluting my character instead of actually building something. What the game doesn't explain clearly is that each stat has a well-defined and very impactful function. Strength is pure, direct damage, no mystery there. Agility is where things get interesting, because besides attack speed, it also reduces cooldowns through haste, which means an agile build can use skills much more frequently. Intelligence fuels magical abilities and is less popular, but it works very well in specific builds that explore that path. The error I made was trying to balance all three at the same time, and the result was a character that was mediocre at everything. What actually works is choosing two primary stats right at the start of the run and focusing on them consistently throughout the progression. When you do this, the growth starts to feel exponential rather than linear, and your character gains a real combat identity. The choice of the two stats will depend on the style you want to play in that specific run. If you like constant pressure and fast combos, agility with strength makes a lot of sense. If you want to explore the magical side, intelligence enters the equation. The important thing is to decide early and have the discipline not to get distracted by upgrades that don't feed what you're building. Runs with a clear focus go much further than indecisive runs. If there's one thing Cinderia does differently from many roguelikes, it's putting the equipment and crafting system at the center of everything. For a while, I treated this as secondary, only swapping pieces when something obviously better appeared and ignoring recycling. This was a huge mistake because I was wasting resources that make a real difference in run progression. The first thing that changed my approach was understanding that slots are limited by design, and this is intentional. The game wants you to make decisions, to recycle what doesn't work, and to use those materials to build something with purpose. Since I started consistently recycling everything that didn't fit into what I was building, the materials available for crafting completely changed, and with them, the possibilities for synergy. Speaking of synergy, there's a specific combination I discovered that I need to share. The reversing wheel, that gear that activates a spinning blade on dash, combined with poison darts and anything that increases critical hit chance. It sounds too specific on paper, but when these three elements are active at the same time, bosses simply melt. The poison accumulates while the crits multiply the damage, and the dash with the blade adds constant pressure that gives no room to breathe. Crafting in Cinderia isn't a parallel system, it's the soul of the game, as the title of the tip says. The best runs I've had didn't come from lucky drops, they came from actively building the right synergies with the materials I knew how to gather. It's very much worth stopping, analyzing what you have, and thinking about how the pieces connect before simply equipping whatever has the highest number.